relatively calm out here in the North Sea this morning, and I'm pretty much alone apart from a few seals here, there and everywhere. But 1,200 years ago, this would have been a very different place. A group of fearsome warriors would have been searching these waters for riches and power, and they would have been heading for our shores.
And on the 8th of June 793 AD, they arrived, landing their fleet of ships on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the Northumberland coast.
The events that unfolded marked a turning point in British history, the start of the Viking era.
Their greatest conquest was Britain, and this was the starting point. Lindisfarne was then home to a rich and important monastery, a centre for learning and pilgrimage. And it was those same riches that attracted the Viking invaders on that fateful day 1,200 years ago. But exactly where on the island did the monastery lie? Today, an archaeological team is hunting for the evidence. As digs go, they don't come much more significant than this.
What is it about Holy Island, then, that you like as an archaeologist?
That's almost an impossible question for someone like me to answer. It has such a rich history, but obviously the reason that we're here is because of the absolutely iconic early monastery, the ones that the Vikings raided at the beginning of the Viking Age in Britain. Incredibly, even though there's so much history here, no one had ever come looking for that early monastery.
Now, I know I'm relatively new to this, but, I mean...
Everybody says that. No, it's a very common misconception, but what you're seeing there is much later. That was established in 11th, 12th century.
Okay.
And actually is much, much smaller than what the original monastery would have been.
Think the monastery here was just a big church? Think again. It was basically a self-contained monastic town. The headland would have been covered with chapels, workshops, farm buildings, houses. Everything you'd need for the day-to-day running of one of the most important religious sites in Britain.
How much do we know about that infamous day of the raids?
We don't know anything conclusively. We imagine, and it's impossible to be on this island as an archaeologist without waking up every morning and coming out here and going, where was it, you know? Where did they pull their boats up? But part of my job is to step away from that and think about the science of it, to let the evidence tell its own story. Every time we find something from that early Anglo-Saxon period, you ask yourself, was this one of the people that saw those boats pull up to the harbour that day?
What are the chances of finding people who, with those sort of wounds that make it look like they were murdered by the Vikings?
It could happen. It might not happen. We don't know. I mean, they're here, obviously. They must have been. If you're going to have a raid of that size, people would have died a violent death, and then I'm assuming they must be buried here. But, you know, they could be in our trenches, or they might be in another cemetery.
Right, let's get in there.
Lindisfarne, a stunning island off England's northeast coast. 1,200 years ago, it was one of the most important Christian sites in Britain. Home to a monastery that attracted pilgrims from far and wide, and a treasure house of priceless religious relics and artefacts.
Today, archaeologists are looking for evidence of the monastery that was targeted by Vikings in the first of many raids on British soil.
Over the last 3 years, they've been slowly troweling back the layers of soil. In their first year of digging, graves were uncovered from what's thought to be the monastery's cemetery.
We found them in situ, so that means they hadn't been touched since they've been buried. It's very evocative because, of course, the Skellies were buried in the very early Christian way. When you're here looking for the early monastery and then you find the bodies from that period, you think to yourself, wow, X marks the spot.
Bone analysis has revealed that the bodies had been wrapped in shrouds and laid out east to west, typical of an early medieval Christian burial. But who were these people?
There's lots of theories about who they could have been. What we've discovered is some of them are female, some of them are children. We've also got 2 very early neonatal babies. So what we think we've got is actually the lay population rather than the monks. There would have been a massive community of people living here, a lay community, supporting the economy of the monastery. So, you know, we have not yet found any skellies that show evidence, let's say, of battle trauma,
Right.
although that's something that is entirely possible as we keep going.
Oh, that does look like a skull, yeah.
The excavation of the cemetery is continuing. Any further remains they find this year could help shed light on what day-to-day life was like here, as well as on that infamous Viking attack.
How much do we know about this person? Well, we think probably someone from the 8th or 9th century related to the monastery here at Lindisfarne. And all we're really trying to do is work our way around the bone to expose as much of it as we can.
What is this here? Because this is not bone.
No, that's a little white quartz pebble, and we've been finding them all over the cemetery. We think they're pretty much like how we would take flowers to a grave as a mark of respect. They seem to have been doing something pretty similar here. There are little white quartz pebbles all over the place.
So what are the chances that this could be someone who was murdered by the Viking raids?
We haven't got any evidence that this particular skeleton was killed during a raid. We don't see any injury marks or anything like that at the moment. So once we've fully exposed the skeleton, we'll lift out all of the bones and we'll take them to get them analysed. We'll try and work out things like how old the person was when they died, whether they were male or female, were they from far away, from quite local. And that's when you can really start telling the story about what have you got here, what does that tell us about Lindisfarne and the people that lived here in the 8th and 9th centuries.
Pillage, plunder, terror, murder. The history books and Hollywood tell us of crazed axe-wielding warriors in horned helmets, and it all started right here.
I'm on the island of Lindisfarne, joining the search for evidence of the first major Viking raid on British shores. 10 days in, and a major development. The dig team believe they may have uncovered the location of the monastery that the invaders targeted back in 793 AD.
We've got a large pit which has several kind of burnt bits of clay in there.
Burnt clay?
Yes. And we think we've got an oven. Now, an oven would have been a pit in the ground, and then you'd build a big clay dome over the top of it. I like to think it's a bread oven.
Okay.
Maybe this was the bakery.
Okay, I'll go with that.
Yeah?
I'm getting the wafts.
Yeah, I get that too.
Evidence found here could help us to piece together the story of the first Viking invasion. Up to now, archaeological evidence of the attack on Lindisfarne has been almost non-existent. A single artefact unearthed in the 1920s may give us a vivid picture of the raid.
This is known as the Doomsday Stone, and you can see carved into one side is a procession of what looks like axe-wielding Vikings. Now, it's possible that this is one monk's memory of that fateful day of bloodshed and terror.
With their own kingdom in Britain established, the Vikings had come a long way from their first hit-and-run raid at Lindisfarne a century earlier. Midway through their dig, the archaeologists are now able to record an outline of one of the monastery buildings that were targeted. Next to this building, a cemetery containing bodies that were buried 1,000 years ago. Incredibly, even some of their names are emerging.
This is a portion of a name stone, Anglo-Saxon grave marker, actually.
So like a headstone?
Yes, basically.
So what would these marks have been?
It's a name. It spells out Ithfrith. It's something very personal and utterly of the right period, bang on the money for that early monastery.
I want to know more about Ithri.
So do I.
So that's how this works, isn't it? It sort of pulls at the thread of the jumper and we're in.
Yeah, and we're in. We're totally in.
As the dig unearths evidence of the people living at the monastery, I want to find out how the average Scandinavian settler lived here in Britain. Back on Lindisfarne, as the team continue their excavation of the monastery cemetery, another intriguing find has come to the surface.
That looks good, doesn't it?
And then
Oh, Cosmo.
this is the one from last year.
It joins.
Yeah.
Incredibly, the piece of stone found this year matches a fragment unearthed earlier.
That is really remarkably pleasing, isn't it? Show me where it came from. Show me where it came from.
The team now have a complete gravestone. We can learn much about a culture through the way it buries and honours its dead, and that includes Viking culture. Lindisfarne, off the wild Northumberland coast, a serene and picturesque island, but with a violent history. 1,200 years ago, this was a scene of terror and destruction. The monks living in the monastery here became the first of many to die at the hands of Viking warriors. Today, archaeologists and volunteers are hunting for evidence of those unsuspecting victims.
The teeth are looking pretty good.
Yeah.
So that's interesting because that would indicate someone who's been living pretty well.
Or someone who died quite young.
Or someone who died quite, yeah. This is not the only in situ burial we've had from this trench, but obviously it's in a much different condition than the others. Just sort of adds to what we know about the people that were buried here and that were living here at that time. You know, what were the things that were affecting the population? Besides Vikings.
Back where it all started, another find for the dig team, preserved in the soil for 1,200 years.
Here we have the coin of Ethelred II, who was king of Northumbria.
Wow.
And what's so cool about this is that on the back, which you probably can't see because it's so teeny tiny, is the name Fordred. And Fordred was a really well-known person in York who minted coins during this period, sort of mid-8th century.
You've got all of that just from this detail?
Yeah, can you believe it?
Are you finding a lot of these?
No, it's very rare.
I mean, that looks in perfect condition.
I know, it's pretty good, isn't it? I love that you can read the Fordred name on the back because then that just makes you think about Fordred in his workshop making money, you know?
Well, I think that he never would have expected it to be here 1,200 years later.
No, definitely not.
Here on Lindisfarne, the dig is coming to a close for another year. It's been incredible to get a glimpse into life at its once great and powerful monastery, to find out what attracted those raiders from across the North Sea, and to understand why they were able to conquer so much of the country.